Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we are embarking on, well, an intellectual adventure that really starts with a strange confession. It's a confession from a famous writer, G.K. Chesterton, who set out to invent his own philosophy.
And this was a grand quest. He wanted something entirely modern, entirely rational, and most importantly, entirely his own.
Exactly. And after years of this intellectual struggle, he came to this astonishing realization.
With a great deal of humor, I should add.
Oh, absolutely. He realized he had just reinvented, piece by piece, the tenets of traditional Christian orthodoxy.
It's just the ultimate intellectual boomerang. He actually calls his book Orthodoxy a detective story.
A detective story.
Yes, where he's the detective investigating the world, only to find out that the established faith was the answer all along.
And this deep dive isn't really about theology per se. It's a really focused look at his critique of what he called modern thought atheism, materialism, determinism.
Right. And his argument, which is so counterintuitive, is that these systems, far from being liberating, actually lead to this dangerous psychological contraction.
A contraction. We're going to explore why he contends that things like paradox and mystery and a belief in a personal God are, for him, the true prerequisites for a sane mind.
And not just a sane mind, but moral courage, meaningful social reform.
So the journey today really asks you to consider, what if the things we often reject as old-fashioned, dogma and tradition are actually the only things strong enough to keep the human mind from collapsing in on itself? Okay, let's unpack this very unusual route back home.
That phrase, the route back home, is such a beautiful framing device for the whole book.
It really is.
Chesterton compares his whole philosophical quest to a yachtsman.
Right, the yachtsman who miscalculates his course.
Exactly. He sails halfway around the world. He lands on this beautiful, what he thinks is an unknown shore. He's ready to plant the flag, claim this new island for England.
A groundbreaking discovery.
A groundbreaking discovery, only to realize he's just landed at Brighton.
He's just rediscovered England.
He's rediscovered England. And that intellectual shock, that moment of realizing that the truths he'd fought so hard to find for himself had been, common ground for 2,000 years. That's the whole story.
And that metaphor, it just perfectly captures this dual human need he identifies, doesn't it?
It does.
That we need to be at once astonished by the world, but also perfectly at home in it.
That mix of the familiar and the unfamiliar.
Yes, that's what gives life its flavor. What he says, Christendom rightly named romance. But, and this is the interesting part, he doesn't start with romance. He starts somewhere much darker.
Much darker. He starts with the state of the modern, rational mind, which he argues is perpetually on the verge of collapse.
Right. Which brings us to our first section.
Exactly. Chesterton's whole defense of sanity begins in a place most of us try to avoid thinking about, the neighborhood of the madhouse. The first step for him is understanding the maniac as a cautionary tale of logic.
And he immediately goes after this awful modern cliche, believe in yourself.
Oh, he hates it. He tells this story about walking with a publisher who says some man is bound to succeed because, quote, he believes in himself.
And Chesterton is just appalled by this.
Completely appalled. He basically retorts, do you want to know where the men who believe in themselves more colossally than Napoleon are? They're in lunatic asylums.
It's a jarring opening for sure, but it's so brilliant.
It is, because his point is that complete self-confidence isn't a strength, it's a weakness. It's this hysterical, almost superstitious belief that your own internal state is the ultimate reality.
And he observes that the real danger to your mental balance isn't a wild imagination.
Not at all. Poets, he says, are usually sane. Novelists might write about mad people, but they themselves are rarely mad. He points to Shakespeare being extremely businesslike.
So who are the ones who go mad?
The mathematicians, the cashiers, the philosophers who follow one single line of reasoning to its end. The chess players.
This is such a crucial distinction he's making. Because the conventional wisdom is that insanity is, the loss of reason.
Right.
But for Chesterton, it's not the loss of reason. Insanity is caused by logic pushed too far.
That's it. That's the key that unlocks his entire critique of modern thought. The madman is the man who has lost everything except his reason.
So the madman's explanation for his delusion, it's actually logical.
Perfectly logical. It's often complete, unanswerable, even rigorous. If a man believes everyone is conspiring against him, what happens when they all deny it?
It just proves they're part of the conspiracy.
It's just confirmation that they're all excellent conspirators. His theory is perfectly round, it's airtight, it's completely invulnerable to any outside critique.
Okay, help us unpack that idea he uses of the perfect narrow circle. If the logic itself is flawless, what's the actual problem?
The problem is the contraction, the suffocation of it. The madman's mind moves in this perfect narrow circle. Yes, it's complete, but it's spiritually and psychologically shrunken.
He uses an analogy, right?
He does. A bullet is perfectly round, but it's not the world. The madman's internal cosmos is mathematically sound, but it lacks air, lacks humor. It lacks the ability to accept that reality is messy and paradoxical.
So sanity requires something more than just logic.
Sanity requires the ability to step outside of that single airtight argument. You have to be able to see the world from different points of view. As he says, to see the chessboard as white on black and then suddenly see it as black on white.
And the maniac can't do that.
He cannot change his standpoint. He is trapped by his own absolute certainty.
And this is where he makes the incredible leap from the asylum to the academy. He argues that modern philosophies, they suffer from this exact same defect.
Precisely. This is the critical transition. He applies this critique to systems like materialism and determinism, which he calls maniacal schemes because of their rigorous yet confined logic.
Let's talk about materialism, the belief that only matter exists, that consciousness is just, a result of physical interactions.
Right. And materialism offers an explanation of the world that has that same insane simplicity as a conspiracy theory. It's logically complete. It tells you the universe is a machine, and it can explain every single rivet, every cogwheel.
Well, what's the feeling you're left with?
When the explanation is finished, the person looking at it feels that the picture is smaller than the real world.
The materialist, by sticking only to matter and cause and effect, he understands everything.
And yet suddenly, nothing seems worth understanding. The cosmos has just shrunk down to this dreary, inescapable set of fixed reactions.
And that shrinking is the real psychological cost.
It is. And Chesterton finds, paradoxically, that spiritual doctrines actually limit the mind far less than these materialistic denials do. The materialist claims to be free because he's rejected dogma.
But he's actually enslaved.
He's enslaved by the spotless machine of his own philosophy.
Can you clarify that point? Because it feels so counterintuitive. You're saying a belief in God is actually less limiting than disbelief.
Absolutely. The Christian, by contrast, is free to believe in both order and miracle, in natural law and the possibility of spiritual intervention. He accepts the complexity of reality. He's open to novelty, to surprise.
But the materialist who really prides himself on his skepticism and his freedom from superstition, he's actually what's the term he uses?
The slave of the veto.
The slave of the veto. I love that.
It's perfect, isn't it? The materialist is strictly forbidden by his own airtight logic, to admit the slightest speck of spiritualism. He can't entertain a ghost, a genuine moral breakthrough. He can't even keep a tiny imp if it's hiding in a flower.
So his intellectual freedom is just consumed by enforcing this cosmic prohibition, this veto against anything non-material.
Exactly. He is absolutely sure his world is simple and solid, just as the madman is quite sure he is sane.
And if materialism is the theory of the cosmos, then its logical outcome for human action is determinism.
The necessary outcome. The materialist is sure that history is just a chain of causation. Every thought, every action is just the inevitable result of prior material conditions.
And that leads directly to what Chesterton calls
the worst chain that ever fettered a human being. The determinist uses free thought to destroy free will. It's a perfect act of intellectual suicide.
Because while the determinist is free to disbelieve in the will,
the more massive fact is what he is then not free to do, or even to say.
What are the consequences of losing that? What can't he do?
He loses the very foundation of moral language. If every action is inevitable, then praise and blame become meaningless. You're not free to praise a hero or curse a villain or thank someone who helps you. You can't justify an action or urge someone to be better.
He has that line about the mustard.
Yes. You can't even say thank you for the mustard because the waiter was predetermined to bring it and you were predetermined to accept it. It hollows out all human interaction.
But wait, isn't there a modern, almost humanitarian argument for determinism? If we accept that someone's environment caused their actions, doesn't that make us more merciful? We see them as a victim of circumstance.
And that is precisely the queer fallacy that Chesterton wants to challenge. He argues the complete reverse.
How so?
If sin is inevitable, it actually prevents genuine persuasion or reform. You can certainly punish the criminal. You can treat him like a broken machine that needs fixing or scrapping.
But you can't appeal to him.
You can't generously appeal to his better feelings. You can't encourage his moral struggle because all of that relies on the very free will that you just denied exists. Determinism ends up being colder, less merciful, because it denies the possibility of real choice and therefore real redemption. You can't say, you should be better.
The stakes here are incredibly high. And this leads us to the culmination of his critique, the suicide of thought and philosophical paralysis.
Yes, this is the peril that the human intellect, being free, is able to destroy itself. It can teach that there is no validity in human thought at all.
We really need to slow down here because this is the core of his defense of dogmatism as a necessity for reason itself.
It is. Chesterton points out that historically religious authority was necessary not to suppress reason, but to defend it.
To defend the authority of a man to think.
Exactly. The creeds, the dogmas, the crusades, they weren't organized to suppress reason. They were organized for the incredibly difficult defense of reason.
How does reason defend itself through faith? That seems like a contradiction.
Because when religion is gone, reason itself starts to sway on its throne. Why? Because both are, at their root, acts of faith.
An act of faith.
You have to take it on faith that the process of your own mind, that connecting A to B will actually lead you to objective truth. If you start to doubt the validity of the thinking tool itself, you can't trust any conclusion it reaches, including the conclusion that nothing is true.
And he saw this philosophical collapse happening all around him in his time, often disguised as intellectual progress.
He saw in two major modern ideas that were tearing things down. The first was the idea of absolute flux.
This is a sort of popularized view of philosophical evolution.
Right. If all things are constantly changing, and there's no such thing as a stable thing, only constant movement, well, then you can't logically think.
Why not?
Because to think, you have to assume a separation between you, the thinker, and the thing you're thinking about. If you are just a temporary confluence of shifting particles, and the thing you're looking at is also dissolving and reforming, how can you hold a fixed thought long enough to analyze it?
Descartes said, I think, therefore I am.
And the philosophic evolutionist effectively negates that. He says, I'm not, therefore I cannot think. It's just intellectual quicksand.
So you have the materialist contracting the world by denying the spiritual, and the radical skeptic dissolving the world by denying the material. But then there's this other attack from the opposite side, what he calls the emptiness of will worship.
Yes, this is the Nietzschean impulse, the Shavian impulse, the idea that man should just assert his will and create himself out of the void.
It's an anti-rationalist movement.
Totally. They argue that the ultimate authority isn't reason or tradition, it's just sheer volition. The supreme point is that a man demands something, not why he demands it. They think they're escaping the rationalist prison by just praising action.
Help us unpack this, because it's another one of his counterintuitive ideas. Why does he say that choosing one course of action, which is self-limitation, is the actual definition of will? If I worship my own will, how does that stop me from choosing?
Because the worshipable will in general is a negation of will in particular.
Mm.
The whole essence of having a will is that it is particular.
Okay.
If you just praise will in general, saying all choices are equally valid expressions of power, you refuse to actually choose. And that is the definition of having no committed will. Every single act of will is an act of self-limitation.
Here's an example.
If I decide to be a carpenter, I am actively rejecting the possibility of being a baker or a lawyer. If I decide to marry one woman, I'm rejecting the possibility of marrying all the others.
This is a beautiful argument. To desire action is to desire limitation. Anarchists say we should have nothing to do with thou shalt not. But Chesterton points out that thou shalt not is just the necessary flip side of I will.
Of course. If I say I will build a house, that choice immediately implies hundreds of thou shalt nots. I shall not use rotten wood. I shall not build it underwater. I shall not stop halfway. The anarchic will worshippers, because they refuse to commit to an ideal, are empty of any real volition.
Infinite possibility, zero reality.
Exactly. And the result of this whole intellectual war on two fronts is, well, philosophical paralysis. The wildly subjective worship of lawlessness and the absolutely objective materialist worship of law, they end in the same void, what Chesterton calls the nirvana of antagonism.
Nirvana. That's a word we usually associate with, blissful peace. But he calls it antagonism.
It's the meeting of two opposing forces, both of which are equally paralyzed. You have the Nietzscheite, who likes all the roads because they are expressions of will, and the Tolstoyan, who hates all the roads because they lead to violence.
And they're both standing at the crossroads.
Helplessly, One can't choose because all choices are magnificent. The other can't choose because all choices are corrupted. They are frozen solid by their own systems.
They stand for endless movement and endless peace, and the result is no movement at all.
Right. And to contrast this, Chesterton holds up a figure of definite historical action, Joan of Arc.
She becomes the symbol of true sanity for him.
She is. She had the noble pity of Tolstoy, but she actually endured poverty while he just admired it from a comfortable distance. She had the courage of Nietzsche, but she actually fought and bled while Nietzsche was famously afraid of a cow. She chose a path, accepted its limitations, and went down it like a thunderbolt.
Her example points to a huge and heroic sanity that he thinks the modern contracted mind has just completely lost. So the critique, in a nutshell, is that the modern attempt to achieve intellectual freedom, whether through skepticism or materialism, doesn't broaden the mind. It actually traps it in a small logical box, making it incapable of moral action or real joy.
And having cleared all that ground, having exposed the intellectual contraction and paralysis of these modern systems, Chesterton then turns to his positive case.
Which is that traditional orthodoxy offers the romance of reality.
He's seeking a philosophy that can provide this necessary mixture of wonder and welcome.
And that's where he brings back the yachtsman analogy. The goal is a faith that is both astonishing and familiar. A queer cosmic town that has the fascination of a new city and the comfort of being your own hometown.
The thrill of the foreign and the relief of belonging all at once.
And he found this dual perspective rooted, surprisingly, in the simple truths of fairy tales and common sense.
For Chesterton, fairy tales are not juvenile fantasies. He says they are entirely reasonable things because they recognize the complexity of existence. They see the arbitrary element in reality. In a way, they embody common sense more accurately than scientific rationalism does.
He outlines two convictions he gets from this ethics of Elfland. First, the universe is wild and startling. Second, that this wildness demands modesty and submission to strange limits, or the magic is lost. This is the magic of condition and limitation.
And the crucial point here is his radical distinction between what is a necessary truth and what is an arbitrary truth. Fairy tales, he says, teach that natural law is arbitrary, not necessary.
Okay, that's a massive claim. We live in a universe governed by, unbreakable laws of physics. What does he mean by arbitrary?
He means we confuse natural laws with mathematical laws. Mathematical laws are necessary. You cannot imagine 2 plus 1 not making 3. It's a logical necessity.
That natural law?
Natural law is arbitrary. You can easily imagine trees growing golden candlesticks instead of apples. You can imagine gravity deciding to take a vacation sometimes. We can't imagine natural law not operating right now, but we can easily imagine it being radically different.
In other words, natural law is just a weird repetition. We don't rely on it as a mathematical certainty. We bet on it.
We bet on it. Nature operates by charm, spell, enchantment, not by a binding contract. He says that calling natural recurrence a law is actually unintellectual because we don't know why the laws work, only that they do.
And this leads to his famous and frankly startling conclusion about the sun.
Yes. The sun rises regularly, not from some dead, inescapable routine like a clockwork mechanism.
But because it never gets tired of rising.
Exactly. Repetition in this view is not lifelessness. It's a continuous, powerful rush of life and will. It is a theatrical encore from heaven, a miracle that's renewed every single morning.
This just completely transforms the meaning of existence, doesn't it? The world is no longer an automatic machine that wound down billions of years ago. It's something that is constantly being willed into being.
It involves a personal, constantly creative magician. And this willful cosmos immediately introduces the doctrine of conditional joy.
Happiness rests on an incomprehensible condition, and if.
Just like in a fairy tale. A box is opened and evils fly out. A word is forgotten and a city perishes. This sense of conditionality explains the philosophical acceptance of seemingly strange limits in life, like the permanence of marriage, monogamy.
The modern sensibility often sees those limits as just restrictions on joy, things to rebel against. Chesterton just flips that on its head.
He flips it entirely. He finds that the modern rebels against these limits, they demonstrate a curious insensibility. They claim to love beauty so intensely, yet they refuse to pay for their pleasure with any kind of symbolic sacrifice or limitation.
They want all the beauty without the commitment that gives it definition.
And that's where he has that incredible line. Keeping to one woman is a small price for so much as seeing one woman.
It's a brilliant reframing. The condition, the choice, the if. That's what makes the joy real and intense and defined.
Without the condition, without the commitment to this particular choice, joy just lacks form. It becomes a meaningless abstraction. You just have generalized pleasure, which Chesterton argued is the death of real desire.
Okay, let's shift to the psychological state here. He also tackles the modern contempt for man's place in the universe. In this section, he calls cosmic coziness and the wreck.
Right, the modern astronomers and philosophers who insist that man must surrender his dignity to the vast, uncaring scale of the cosmos.
And Chesterton just finds this completely unpersuasive.
He says it's like telling a prisoner that his jail cell now covers half the county. It doesn't make him feel free, it just makes the jail bigger. He rejects the intimidation of size.
He argues that the universe, precisely because it's seen as complete and orderly, can actually be conceived of as small, a cozy little cosmos.
A single complete jewel. Its size is totally irrelevant to its moral or intellectual quality.
And if the universe is a complete jewel, that suggests it was made, that it's precious. This connects to that powerful idea of the great might not have been.
Yes, existence is not routine, it's an eccentric privilege. The world feels like something that was given to us under sufferance, something we should treat with wonder like things saved from a shipwreck. We appreciate its survival.
And this is where his personal discovery just clicks into place for him. This feeling that good was a remnant to be stored and held sacred.
It was the wild whisper of something originally wise. He realized that his personal, hard-won optimism had an origin. It was the doctrine of the fall.
So according to Christianity, we were indeed the survivors of a wreck, the crew of a golden ship that had gone down before the beginning of the world.
And this completely reversed his reason for being an optimist. Modern optimists try to prove that we fit into the world naturally, that we are exactly what the universe ordered.
But Christian optimism is based on the fact that we do not fit in naturally. We're a monstrosity, both worse and better than all other things.
So the modern philosopher said, you are in the right place, you're perfectly evolved, and the listener felt depressed.
And Christianity said, you are in the wrong place, you are a noble ruin, and his soul sang for joy.
Because the wrongness, that sense of alienation and homesickness, it finally explained the problem of being alive. It transformed alienation from a scientific dead end into a powerful spiritual clue.
This psychological and metaphysical foundation, it leads us right to the heart of his argument. How Christianity's internal contradictions, its paradoxes, are the only system strong enough to contain the chaotic truths of reality.
He calls the world's nature the hidden irregularity.
The world isn't chaotic, but it is nearly reasonable, which makes it a trap for logicians. It's the silent swerving from accuracy by an inch that's the uncanny element.
He uses the analogy of the human body again. A pure mathematician from the moon lands on Earth. He rationally deduces that since we have 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, we must have 2 hearts.
But when he looks for the second heart,
he finds this silent, surprising asymmetry. The world has these quirks, these moments of deliberate, willful irregularity.
And the claim is that Christianity is the right key for this lock. It not only goes right about things, but what's the phrase?
Goes wrong exactly where the things go wrong.
I love that.
It anticipated the secret irregularities of reality. It admits a man has 2 hands, but not that he has 2 hearts. The creed isn't logically tidy. It contains these necessary contradictions, the divine and the human, the fixed and the free, which mirror the truth of the universe.
And this necessary complexity is why the faith has always been attacked for contradictory reasons. Which brings us to the fusion of extremes, the central paradox.
Yes, the classic critique. Christianity was accused of being too optimistic about the universe, all that mystical joy and faith, and at the same time, too pessimistic about the world. Asceticism, martyrdom, sin.
So how does one creed contain both this profound joy in existence and this radical detachment from it?
Chesterton illustrates this explosive balance by looking at the Christian attitudes toward death, specifically the martyr versus the suicide.
Right. The Christian attitude was one of wild encouragement for the martyr, but weird harshness for the suicide. Burial at the crossroads.
They both choose death, yet they are at opposite ends of heaven and hell.
Why such a fierce distinction? I mean, they both renounce earthly life.
Because the nature of their renunciation is fundamentally different. The martyr, no matter how much he renounces the world, sets his heart outside himself. He dies so that something else, an ideal, the truth, other people, may live.
He's making the ultimate affirmation of life's value.
The ultimate affirmation, the suicide, conversely, is the absolute evil. He's refusing to take the oath of loyalty to life. He isn't a builder or a reformer.
Mm.
He's just a destroyer. He insults everything on earth by not even bothering to steal it, by not appreciating it.
The martyr sacrifices himself to keep the world going. The suicide wants the world to end with him.
Precisely. And so the Christianity achieves this necessary explosive balance. A first loyalty to existence itself, and then a ruinous radical reform of existence. This is the ethical method, finding a moderation that isn't a dilution, but the still crash of two impetuous emotions.
And this dynamic balance is required for every practical virtue. Let's dig into those ethical paradoxes, starting with courage.
Courage is one of the most basic human needs, but Chesterton shows it's almost a contradiction in terms,
It means a strong desire to live.
taking the form of a strange carelessness about dying. A soldier must seek life and victory in a spirit of furious indifference to his own survival. He has to desire life like water and yet drink death like wine.
Because if he loves life too much, he becomes a coward.
And if he's indifferent to life, he becomes careless and reckless. You need the paradox, the intense valuation of life combined with the casual ability to let it go for real courage. And this isn't just mysticism for saints, it's practical advice for sailors and mountaineers.
Then there's the paradox of humility and pride.
Right, the rationalist finds a logical mean. He's content with his moderate place, not insolent. But that mean is just a dilution. It loses the vital force of both extremes.
It loses the poetry of being proud and the poetry of being humble.
Exactly. Christianity exaggerates both simultaneously and paradoxically.
How does it manage that?
Man, as man, the creature made in God's image, is the chief of creatures. He demands crowns and peacock plumage and immortal destiny. This saves the poetry of being proud.
But man as a man.
As an individual person, is the chief of sinners. He requires the bleaching truth of fasting and repentance. This saves the poetry of being humble. It gives you an open playground for the happy pessimist, as long as you aim your pessimism only at yourself.
It allows a person to be infinitely hopeful about humanity while being personally crushed by their own shortcomings. That's a powerful psychological tool. And finally, the paradox of forgiveness.
The sensible pagan could forgive a pardonable mistake, but he rightly condemned the traitor, the unforgivable sin. Christianity did something different. It cleaved the crime from the criminal.
Which means
We must be much angrier at the theft than before, maintaining a pure, fixed horror of injustice, and yet much kinder to thieves than before. Forgive unto 70 times 7.
the pagan would have to reduce his hatred of the theft to be kinder to the thief.
The Christian, by separating the evil concept from the person, allows both love and wrath to burn at their highest intensity. You can hate the sin with a purified hatred and love the sinner with an undiluted love.
This brings us to a crucial political application, the defense of true progress, reform. We established earlier that the ideal must be fixed, or all failure is just fruitless.
Right. Progress must be reform, which implies shaping the world to a fixed form or ideal. Modern progress, however, had just become mere movement, which means constantly changing the vision itself.
And Chesterton states this so emphatically. Progress should mean we're always changing the world to suit the vision. But now it means we're always changing the vision to suit the world.
If the ideal is always moving, then no ideal will ever remain long enough to be realized. The modern young man who constantly shifts his moral code will never change his environment, because he'll always change his mind first.
And furthermore, he says the only real reason for being a progressive is not a belief in some inevitable upward evolution.
But a sober, fixed belief that things naturally tend to grow worse. This is the need for the eternal revolution, the constant fight against decay. Human institutions grow old and corrupt with horrible rapidity.
And this need for constant suspicious vigilance against decay. This is just the Christian doctrine of original sin.
It's the fixed fact that men are naturally backsliders, prone to corruption if you just leave them alone.
The Christian position is that human virtue tends to rust or rot on its own, especially in proud, successful people who forget what it means to struggle.
And this insight becomes the vital defense of democracy. It's the ultimate argument against placing unconditional trust in the ruling class.
Yes, that leads right to his sharpest political insight, the untrustworthiness of the rich.
The whole modern world is based on this quiet, unexamined assumption that the rich are trustworthy, or at least that their comfortable environment makes them better suited to rule.
It's a point that cuts against so many arguments of his time, like the humanitarian socialist who argues the poor are morally degraded by their environment.
Right. If that premise were true, the logical conclusion isn't to empower the poor, but to disenfranchise them. Give all the power to those who already have the clean air and comfortable conditions. the rich.
But Christianity provides the only powerful objection to this confidence in the wealthy. Christ's words about the rich man and the needle's eye mean, at the very least, that rich men are not very likely to be morally trustworthy.
The whole Christian case here is that a man dependent on luxuries is spiritually corrupt, politically corrupt, financially corrupt. The rich man is already bought, already bribed by comfort. That's why he's rich. He has sacrificed principle for ease.
So this paradox that the person best equipped to rule is the one who has resisted the greatest temptation leads to the Christian view of the ideal ruler.
The man should rule who does not think he can rule.
The true Christian ruler, when offered power, must sincerely say,
Nolo episcopari.
which means, I do not wish to be bishop. It's the ideal of the reluctant, humble leader who only takes power out of a sense of duty, not self-confidence.
And that, for Chesterton, is why democracy itself is profoundly Christian. It's an attempt to get the opinion of those who would be too modest to offer it. It's a mystical adventure, trusting those who don't trust themselves, and in doing so, encouraging the humble.
We've established this paradoxical balance of orthodoxy as the basis for sanity, morality, and reform. So to finalize the picture, Chesterton clarifies how the system separates itself from other spiritual frameworks, starting with the conflict with pantheism.
Pantheism, the idea that God is everything, that everything is divine. It sounds beautiful and unifying, but Chesterton shows it leads to moral and intellectual stasis.
Because if one thing is as good as another, since all are divine, then you can't truly wonder or praise, you're just praising yourself.
And more importantly, you can't act. Action requires making a judgment, saying this is better than that. If you're merged into a divine oneness, moral action and reform become impossible. You just have to accept everything as it is.
The Christian solution reframes the relationship with nature. Pantheism says nature is our mother, which implies we must submit to her.
But Christianity says nature is our sister. We share the same Father, the Creator, but she has no ultimate authority over us. We're free to admire her beauty, but also to correct her faults, to draw firm moral boundaries against her wilder impulses.
This gives Christian joy a touch of lightness, even humor. Nature isn't this solemn, dominating mother, but a dancing younger sister to be laughed at and loved.
Right. It allows us to be environmentalists who love the natural order and radical reformers who want to improve the human condition all at the same time.
He also argues, strikingly, that the complexity of the faith, specifically the Trinitarian advantage, provides greater liberty than a pure, lonely monotheism.
Yes, the complex God of the Athanasian Creed, though it's an enigma to the intellect, is less likely to become that cruel, lonely, Eastern king type of God that's historically associated with the scimitar and bloodshed.
What's the psychological benefit of the Trinity in this context?
The Trinitarian idea suggests a divine society, a council at which mercy pleads as well as justice, where love and interaction are internal to the Godhead itself. It offers liberty and variety existing even in the inmost chamber of the world.
The Western social instinct is captured here. It's not well for God to be alone.
That internal variety suggests a dynamic reality, not a monolithic, static one. And this dynamic tension also feeds the need for purpose. He argues that a belief in the purpose of peril, the actual possibility of failure, of damnation, is essential.
Why?
Because existence is a story. It's thrilling, it's full of will and risk, not a scientific plan that's guaranteed to end well.
If all is well anyhow, regardless of our choices.
Then there's no trumpet blast for action. The Christian moral system tells you, you must take care that you don't lose your soul. This urgency, this necessary danger, is what fuels the constant self-renewal and revolutionary energy of European civilization. If the universe is a guaranteed success, it's boring. If it's a race you can lose, it's thrilling.
Okay, moving to the final intellectual confrontation. Chesterton tackles common atheist arguments, what he calls skepticism's false facts. For instance, the belief that man is merely an animal based on physical similarity.
The physical likeness between man and brute is a biological truism. But Chesterton says that's not the shock. The shock, the real enigma, is that being so physically alike, man is insanely unlike in every other meaningful way.
This is the towering eccentricity of man.
Yes. We spend too much time on the similarities. We should be focusing on the radical, inexplicable difference.
Why does the ape not play the violin?
Exactly. Why do elephants not build colossal temples? Why doesn't the beaver question the necessity of dams? Man is the only wild animal. All the others follow the predictable respectability of their tribe. Man alone is restless, spiritual, dissatisfied. The chasm between man and brute is where all religion and philosophy must begin.
And then there's the argument that primeval religion began in fear, in darkness, superstitious terror.
Chesterton looks at history and legend and finds no evidence for this. The earliest legends, like the stories of Isaac or Iphigenia, they introduce human sacrifice not as something old and natural.
But as a strange and frightful exception, a breaking of an older, purer taboo.
He suggests the entire human race carries a deep tradition of the fall, a memory of a catastrophic descent from a better state, not a tradition of slow, upward progress from barbarism.
This brings us to the ultimate synthesis and the payoff for the listener, the unseen energy of Christendom. Why is European civilization always changing, always dying daily and being reborn, while other great civilizations die with dignity and finality?
Our civilization ought to have died with Rome. The fact that we are still here, constantly reinventing ourselves, means we are all revenants, dead pagans walking about, sustained by an awful galvanic life working in what would have been a corpse. This constant internal self-renewing energy, he argues, is supernatural life, not just sociological survival.
And this power comes from the unpopular ideas, the things that sound harsh at first, but prove to be the foundations of sanity and human brotherhood.
Absolutely. When Christianity preaches original sin, it immediately delivers democracy and pity. Because only with original sin, which applies to everyone equally, can you simultaneously pity the beggar and distrust the king.
Modern philosophies offer health and freedom, but deliver bodily slavery and spiritual tedium because they confine man to that small box of materialism or the endless flux of skepticism.
But orthodoxy, by contrast, satisfies this ancestral instinct for being the right way up.
For the skeptic, joy has to be carefully contracted, clinging to one small corner of the material world, while grief is spread through this unthinkable, infinite, indifferent eternity.
He's topsy-turvy. His feet are dancing in idle ecstasies, while his brain is trapped in the abyss of cosmic meaninglessness.
And when he writes himself through the creed, when he accepts the paradoxes, he realizes that joy becomes something gigantic and necessary, and sadness becomes something special and small. The silence around us is not the heartless silence of an idiot universe.
It is, as Chesterton suggests, the prompt, careful stillness that's necessary in a sick room, where everyone is waiting for the patient to heal and for the party to resume.
We have explored how the Christian God, unlike all the gods of unalterable recurrence, uniquely contains the virtue of courage, having been a rebel as well as a king. We often reflect on the anger Christ never restrained, flinging furniture in the temple. But Chesterton suggests that he constantly covered some one thing that was too great for God to show us when he walked upon this earth.
And Chesterton often fancied that this hidden element was his mirth, the tremendous, overwhelming, self-renewing joy of the divine, too loud, too magnificent for us to hear in our current state.
So what does it mean for you if the silence around us isn't the sound of absence or indifference, but only the quiet necessary in a sick room, just waiting for the sound of divine laughter to finally break out?